Welcome to Working Through Conflict. This presentation is presented by Harmonious Resolutions, and the purpose of this workshop is to help you get a baseline understanding of how to work through conflict before future presentations. To provide a little introduction into myself and Harmonious Resolutions, I am Alyssa Bernhardt. I do have a master's degree in conflict management. I'm a Tennessee Supreme Court Rule 31 trained civil mediator, as well as a certified Montana civil mediator. Through Harmonious Resolutions, I train lots of people in different organizations on how to use conflict skills in the workplace, in their organization, in their personal life. I'm also a professional in human resources and an experienced nonprofit leader. I work with a lot of nonprofit organizations. And of particular interest to this workshop, I am the managing director of a national service sorority. So I have a lot of experience working with college students, and I'm excited to share a little bit about what I've learned and how my conflict management skills intersect with all of you. A little about Harmonious Resolutions. So, through Harmonious Resolutions, we train organizational teams and people on the tools that are needed to integrate conflict management into everyday practice. And doing this allows people to become more well rounded and more productive. We also aim to create harmony in organizations by ensuring each person has the space and tools to navigate through and prosper from conflict. I've been doing this long enough to know that people are always interested in how in the world did you get to conflict management? Which is a great question. And, it's a long and winding road, as you can see by the arrow here, that I think started when I was very young. And as it does for many young children or toddlers who are questioning and pushing boundaries and limits and kind of testing what can be, I was doing the same. And for some children, they get the answers they're looking for and they build trust and move on. And I think for me, particularly, I have a personality style that really invites conflict and views what others call conflict as communication and just a desire to have tough conversations and confront challenges and issues that we may have. So for me, this has been a lifelong journey that was especially challenging when I became a college student and had roommates for the first time and was dealing with parents who, had boundaries still, even though I wasn't living at home. So, and that continued into my first job out of college. And kind of piqued my interest in conflict management specifically and learning more about tools to manage conflict and understanding why people react the way they do happened in about 2012 when I was working a job that I would have told you I love this job. It's the best job I've ever had. But there were really challenging communication issues on the leadership team at the organization. And people often took things personally that were not personal, they were business, they were things that needed to be discussed. And I just felt like I really needed to have a better understanding of why people react this way and how I could train people to understand that confrontation and conflict are not the same thing. So that's how I ended up here. I started Harmonious Resolutions in 2016, shortly after I graduated with my master's in conflict management. And I have worked with other university parent and family programs. I've worked with sororities and fraternities and a lot of organizations in the nonprofit and also in the for profit world. Today, I am going to talk about the need to have those difficult conversations in order to manage conflict, reduce conflict, build trust. I'm going to share a little bit about the most common types of conflict you should expect to experience with your college student and really help you understand the dynamics of conflict, including those conflict response styles. This is sort of just an introduction to conflict response styles. There's a lot more information out there, which I will share. And I hope to give you all a few tools to initiate and facilitate difficult conversations, and really provide you additional resources if you want to investigate this further. So let's dive in. The first part is really to understand conflict and understand the conflict types. I think this goes without saying, but I always feel it important to actually say it, that conflict is inevitable. As you all know, you are families with students in college. You have certainly experienced conflict with your student throughout their life, and maybe that is even more challenging now, or perhaps you're looking for ways to better manage it now that your college student is out on their own, and sort of building their life. So I operate firmly from the belief that confrontation is not the same thing as conflict. People often say, when you say like, oh, what is conflict to you, people will often say, well, confrontation. And so I want to start this off before we get into the different types of conflict and how to manage conflict, with saying that, like, I firmly believe that confrontation is not the same thing as conflict. Confrontation is a form of conflict of approaching conflict that often has a negative connotation. And I would like for everyone to come into this workshop, and as we get into the conflict types and how to manage conflict, with an open mind and understanding that conflict is necessary, it's inevitable. We experience it every single day in small ways, often in large ways, and having an open mind will help you really sit back and understand, oh, yeah, I experience these types of conflict, and this is true. I need to communicate better about this. So, as we dive in to this, I hope to really give you some examples that bring understanding to you, and then also moving into the next section to talk about ways to manage conflict. So, the first type of conflict that we most often experience is task conflict. So, these conflict types are applicable to workplaces, to structure, to organizations, to university systems, and to life in general. So, some of the terms may come off as sort of sterile to you or unrelatable, and I just ask again that you have an open mind. So, task conflict is really related to roles and responsibilities, priorities, goals, maybe the strategy that we carry. So, some examples of this for your college student could be time management, financial responsibility, perhaps like your student has a job and they're responsible for paying things for the first time and being responsible to that. Academic performance, this is a task that college students have responsibility for ensuring that their academic performance meets the standards, at the very least, of the university. But a source of conflict with you and your college student could be how the academic performance, like your standards for academic performance and how they are meeting those. Living arrangements is often a task related conflict. It could be issues that your college student is having with their living arrangements. It could be challenges that you experience managing living arrangements with your college student. There may also be some challenges around living arrangements, as you're preparing a college student to go off to school. Like, should they have off-campus housing, on-campus housing? Should they live at home? Some challenges here with your students' independence and social life and overall college experience. Some other examples of task conflict also include um, career choices. Sometimes, students are exploring their interests and potential career paths, and their choices may conflict with their family's expectations or their traditional values. This relates directly back to those goals and priorities. Also, a common theme that you'll find in all of the conflict types is cultural or religious expectations. Sometimes families, maybe you, have specific cultural or religious expectations, and these may clash with your students' newfound independence or their, recently developed personal beliefs and values. The second type of conflict is relationship conflicts. These can arise very frequently. I would say this is probably the most common type of conflict that you'll experience. And relationship conflicts are really rooted in those, like, prior knowledge, prior negative experience, personality styles, which is something that you've probably been dealing with your college student for a very long time. And then conflict response styles, which we're going to talk about a little bit more, and stereotypes, which again goes into that cultural differences. So, some examples of this are communication issues. So, as your student becomes more independent, you may feel like you're left out or you're not receiving regular updates about your child's life. This is very common, something that we hear regularly in the university space. And students are, sort of pushing for independence, and they may feel that you're overbearing or you're invading their privacy, which can lead to a lot of issues. Then emotional support. College is really, really stressful. Students can feel that their families aren't providing the right emotional support or enough emotional support, or maybe just simply not understanding their struggles. And on the opposite end, you may feel that you have led a lot of efforts to provide support and you feel like you're being rejected or unappreciated. As we talked about in the last slide with task conflict, values and beliefs may change. College is really a time of personal growth and exploration. Your student is developing their own values, beliefs, and lifestyles, maybe for the first time that really differ from your family's expectations or traditions. And this can certainly lead to a sense of disconnection that can lead to conflict or that can feel like conflict, even though it is disconnection. Parental roles and boundaries, of course, is a relationship conflict. Again, your student has a newfound independence, is really establishing themselves and really pushing you to develop what they would consider appropriate boundaries. The students don't want to be treated like children anymore. They want to be treated like adults. And sometimes maybe they are not acting fully like adults. So you're sort of balancing how to treat them like an adult based on their expectations and also still shepherd them through this next stage of their life. Mental health issues, as you all know, this is a very common struggle that college students face. And sometimes the family may not really understand why there is such anxiety or stress or depression, and maybe adequate support is not offered. So this is something, much larger than this workshop to consider, but how to understand the resources available to your student at Georgia Tech and how to direct them to those. And then finally, again, cultural differences. I don't think we can harp on this enough. Maybe your culture has norms as it relates to education, career choices, personal independence. And those are things that your college student is testing and maybe rebelling against. And the third most common type of conflict is structural. Sometimes we call this organizational when we're talking in bigger picture about like workplaces or large organizations. But in family systems, I would consider this structural. So this is really related to resources, schedules, institutional, as in Georgia Tech, policies and procedures, and again, cultural norms. So some examples of this could be time constraints. College students have really, really packed schedules, especially at Georgia Tech. There's high standards. They're packing their schedules with classes. They have study time built in. Maybe they have extracurricular activities. Perhaps they're pursuing some social commitments, or have standing commitments with friends, and it can make it really, really challenging for you to find time to visit or communicate regularly with your student, which definitely can create conflict. It can feel very disconnecting. It can really strain your relationship. Geographic distance, that's another one that's really challenging with college student and sort of related to that schedule or the resources. If your student is attending Georgia Tech far from where you live, that physical distance can really create logistical challenges for maintaining those close family relationships. And then frequent visits or being able to attend family events on campus may be really challenging due to limited financial resources. Institutional policies and procedures. So, obviously, Georgia Tech has policies and procedures like academic requirements, housing regulations, disciplinary processes, etc., that may really conflict with your family expectations or your cultural norms. And these are things you don't really understand because you're not a student at Georgia Tech, and maybe your student has trouble explaining these to you in a way that you understand. We kind of touched on this a bit about time constraints and geographic distance, but there are differing accesses to resources, and so depending on your socioeconomic status or again, like your work obligations, where you are geographically compared to Georgia Tech, there could be limited resources, and these limited resources could be technology to have regular conversations with your student, transportation to visit your student, or just support services in general. And your student may also be feeling this on campus. They may be feeling that they come from a different level of access to resources and maybe are feeling a disparity in their college experience compared to their peers. So, this is definitely something to keep in mind. And then generational differences. For sure, families and their college students have differing perspectives and experiences due to generational gaps, and this could lead to misunderstandings or conflict regarding those expectations, values, and approaches to education or personal development. I think, the generational differences are to be expected, but sometimes it is really challenging as families of a college student, um, work to better understand how this generation is changing and how you need to adapt to meet them. So, as a review, the three types of conflict are task, relationship, and structural. Now we're going to shift a little bit from those three main types of conflicts. We've given some examples and explained how you may be experiencing those types of conflict with your student at Georgia Tech. And now we're going to talk about how we can work through this conflict. And I'm going to give you a few examples of how to understand conflict and some visuals of how to look at conflict. The first one is the conflict iceberg. So, this is really just a visual to demonstrate that there's a line at the top of the triangle, and at the very top is issues. That's the main thing that we need to focus on. And below the line, there's personalities, emotions. Everyone has different interests, needs, desires. We all have our own self perceptions and different, varying levels of self esteem. Maybe we have hidden expectations. I find this to be pretty common with college students and their families is that maybe the parents have expectations that you're holding back a little bit, um, from the college student, but you still are holding that. It's still contributing to issues that you have. Maybe there are unresolved issues from the past. I think this is also something we experience pretty regularly with college students, as we've talked about. This is sort of the first time that they are, out on their own and figuring things out on their own with a level of independence that they've never had before. And maybe as they get out into that world and are communicating with other people, they start to feel like, oh, maybe there's some issues from my childhood or from the past that haven't been resolved. And maybe they don't know how to have those conversations. So that's sort of bubbling below this line, below the surface. So, the most important thing when we're visualizing this conflict iceberg is to remember that the issues are at the top. And what conflict practitioners often say is you there's this whole group of things below the line. We talk about the line a lot. And there's things below the line and things above the line. And the things above the line are things that we can control or that we can work through. And so that's demonstrated here as well. There are these issues, and the issues probably you have some in common. between your college student and their families. There are issues in common, but we don't know that until we kind of figure it out. Maybe we have to get below the surface a little bit. We have to accept, okay, our personalities are different. We have to talk about our emotions and understand what each person's emotions are for the situation. Then we need to talk about, okay, well, what am I most interested in? What do I need? What do I need from this? What does my student need? What are they interested in from this situation? We're not going to break down all of these every single time. So we're probably not going to resolve all the issues from the past or, bring up all the hidden expectations. But when we do work below the line and we do accept that like everyone has their own emotions, everyone has their own interests, everyone has their own needs and desires, and we can kind of see that often they overlap. What you might have as an interest, your student will also have as an interest, and that's kind of the point here is to recognize like, okay, we're not going to be the same in everything, but we do have overlapping um, pieces to this, and we can acknowledge that. And that will really help us to move forward. It will help us to see how they relate to the issues. It will help us reach an agreement on the issues. So the conflict iceberg is just a good visual for you to be able to remember, okay, these are issues and what's going on below the surface. Considering needs and feelings can be really, really challenging. And I often talk about this, and I always have the caveat that, of course, there are more human needs and there are more feelings, but these are what are generally considered the six main feelings or bodily sensations, and these are the six basic human needs. I think this is super, super helpful in conflict conversations. As I talk about this, you may even go back to the conflict iceberg and think, like, oh, yeah, that's a feeling that they're having, and this is why. So often, maybe with a college student, the feeling is mad, and the need is autonomy. They're looking for autonomy. Probably autonomy is one of the major needs that you'll come to understand as a point of conflict. Also growth. And then I think love too, love and safety. Your college student is still going to be seeking those from you, but they want those to be balanced with the autonomy, the growth. They want to create their own level of contribution and predictability. So let's take a minute and review what these six needs are and the six feelings. Now, these come in handy, the needs and feelings come in handy when we talk about this form of working through conflict, which is nonviolent communication. Nonviolent communication is something that was created by Marshall Rosenberg. As you see, these are three books that he wrote. I highly recommend reviewing these books. I think they're super helpful, not just in thinking of conflict with your college student, but also in all conflict situations that you may experience. If you're working full time or if you're working with other people, you may encounter this. So, this is just a really helpful framework for managing difficult conversations and conflict scenarios. And this directly relates to those needs and feelings. So, there's four basic steps to nonviolent communication. One is an observation, two are feelings, three is needs, and four is request. So, one is you would say, when I see or hear, so when I see you do XYZ, or when I hear you've done XYZ, it makes me feel blank because I need blank. So again, back to those feelings and needs. And then you make a request. I think this is a really great framework for your college student as well, that may help you actually meet them where they are and give them what they need. So, um, there's a lot more feelings and needs, as I gave the caveat in the previous slide, that those are just three. Um, in Living Nonviolent Communication, the book in the middle, and the book on the left, Nonviolent Communication, A Language of Life. In the beginning of those books, there are a lot of lists of potential feelings and how they connect to needs. I find that to be really helpful. Often, I think college students, as they are gaining this newfound level of independence and managing a lot of situations that they've never managed before, I find that taking a moment to identify feelings and needs is really, really hard. So, if we can give our students the tools, and if we can model those tools, it can be really, really helpful for them. The second way of working through conflict is really about de-escalation. Maybe you found yourself in a very intense conflict with your student, and you just are thinking, my goodness, I need to de-escalate this as quickly as possible, or I need to bring this down a few notches. So that's what this tool is for. So de-escalation is really related to, just bringing it down a few notches. The first thing that you can do is validate. This is really hard for some generations of people, maybe people in certain cultures, to validate your child. And it's really important to validate that their perception is their reality, what they're feeling is real, it's valid, their concerns are valid. And then actively listen. This can be really challenging for some people, depending on your personality style, parenting style, so many different things. Um, but really, really listening and not wanting to interrupt or jump in with your own concerns, but just taking a few moments and just fully listening to them. Asking questions can be really helpful to show that like you care and you're really trying to understand. It's really important that these questions don't come off as like judgments or intense, but rather just like, I really want to understand. Please help me understand this. Some examples could be like, what I hear you're saying is XYZ. Is that true? Is that accurate? Um, Anything that you can do to clarify is really helpful. And then if you can engage your student in brainstorming solutions, so instead of providing them solutions, which I think some of us are really quick to want to do, especially with your child, you might feel like you have it worked out or you have a plan for them. And instead of giving them the solutions, I think it's helpful to brainstorm them. Maybe there are some questions about, like, well, what do you want to see happen from this? What's the best case scenario for you? And kind of understanding like what did they see as solutions. Maybe it's a good opportunity for you to understand, are they wanting you to provide them with solutions, or are they just wanting you to listen and provide that support? So maybe they don't really want solutions, they just want support. And so you can be that listening ear and remain calm and make sure your college student knows that you're there for them, you're listening, you're available. Another example of working through conflict. This is very similar in some ways to nonviolent communication, and also de escalation sort of combines those, is reframing. So, reframing is a really powerful tool for clarifying emotional communications or emotional conflicts, emotional encounters. These are things you probably often experience with your college student. This is also something that I really like to teach all people to use in all aspects of their life. It's really helpful for many situations. So here's some guide. This is, rules, guides for reframing. So one, make I statements. So this is really important. This is really important for your college student, believe me, is to make I statements. So speak for yourself and only yourself. I feel when I see, avoid making accusations or what could feel like accusations, which is using you when you do this. Really being careful to explain your emotions rather than display them. So sometimes maybe we just need a few minutes to gather ourselves. Maybe we need a few days. And I think that's fair. It's fair for you to say, I need some time to think about this. Um, so I can better explain how I'm feeling. Um, so explain your emotions rather than display them. Ask questions that move from emotion to problem solving. I'm going to give some examples of questions and a couple of slides, but there are a lot of questions. You could write down all of the questions that you want to ask, whether they're whether they fit into the I statements or reframing or not. But you can write down all the questions that you want to ask. And then you can go through the list and say, okay, well, these all have emotions tied to them when I really need to be solving problems. So, how can I move from that? You by asking questions, you can help determine what is the common ground that you have. So, as you're asking questions, you're trying to determine, what are those interests and needs, like we talked about in the conflict iceberg, that you have in common. And then when you're reframing, you can share that. You can say, I feel that too, or I value XYZ as well. So that's a really important part of reframing is to find that common ground and to share that back. When using reframing, and honestly, when engaging in any conflict situations, it's really important that we don't threaten anyone's self esteem or self worth. We're very specific instead of being general. This can be really hard for college students, so I would encourage you to be patient and again, model this as best as you can. Sometimes, an example of this is like, well, I'm just mad that you did that. And it's like, okay, well, that is very general. You're just mad at a situation. How can we specify exactly what about this situation is challenging? Always ask for confirmation to understand. So for this, again, like when how I understand that you're explaining this is, and repeat it back to them. So you're like repeating what they said in your own words to check for understanding. Sometimes you'll find that the way that you understand it is absolutely not correct. And this gives your student an opportunity to say, no, that's not at all what I meant by that. And maybe this helps to identify, like, okay, they're using terms that are too general. So we're asking these questions, we're asking confirmation to make sure we understand it. And they may be telling us, no, you don't at all understand what I'm saying, which is really helpful for us to get more specific and get to deeper into understanding the needs and interests. All right, so now I kind of want to shift into like from tools into some other tips, I guess we would call them, for when you're engaging any of the tools that we've talked about. So whether it's reframing, nonviolent communication, we really want to think about some ground rules for difficult conversations. Um, ground rules are pretty standard in mediation. Whenever we have mediations, we set these ground rules from the outset. We work together in a mediation. Both parties come up with ground rules that are important to them. And so these are just some generic ground rules that are used in mediation that I think are extremely important for any conflict conversation, which is why I talk about them here. So, agree to take turns speaking, which means you never interrupt the other person. If you feel a urge to interrupt, you should pause and maybe you need to make a note. You need to write something down, like, oh, I want to come back to what they said about their time management. And then you wait your turn. Again, speaking for yourself and only yourself is really, really, really important, I think, in life, but especially in complex situations that you don't make assumptions or accusations here. Recognize that, like, you can only speak for how you feel. You don't know how the other person is feeling until they tell you. And we want to definitely give them an opportunity to tell us. So speak for yourself and only yourself speak for your experiences and feelings, and then listen carefully. Sometimes we have people who come into mediations who are like, oh, I'm writing everything down, furiously making notes so I can rebut every single thing that they've said. And sometimes when we're making that many notes, we are not listening. So I would encourage you to really, really listen to what your student is saying when you're engaging difficult conversations and being thoughtful about your response. There are also other ground rules. I mean, like I said, ground rules are things that are made up in a mediation. So if you feel like, maybe there's something particularly challenging about having a conversation with your college student, and so you want to work in some ground rules with them, you can do that. You can invite them to create new ground rules. This is very open. These are just some guidelines. So, here are those questions that I talked about and some important considerations to make when you are thinking about how to engage conflict. So, what do you think contributed to the problem? Well, how did you get here? Why are you in this conflict? What led to this? Does the other person simply see things differently than you, which is very possible? Again, like we all have our own personality styles and conflict response styles, so it's pretty normal for us to, feel a certain way. What are some things you can do to prevent a similar situation in the future? I think this is really important. If you don't want to be driving yourself insane through conflict or banging your head on a wall, maybe we experience the same situation once or twice and we figure out, okay, how do we deal with this moving forward? How do we prevent this from being a repetitive issue? Can you learn more about the other person and their perspectives? We've talked about this several times, but as your student is really entering a new phase of life and they're evolving into maybe a little bit of a different person, or they're experiencing new perspectives and creating their own, how can you learn more with them? How can you grow along with them on that journey? A question that I think is really important when you are having difficult conversations is this next question. If you could have any solution, what would it be? What would you want? I ask that almost every single time that I have a mediation or like a one-on-one conflict coaching session with someone is, okay, well, if like anything was possible, what would it be? What would you have? And sometimes you'll be surprised by the answer. Sometimes it's something not at all possible. But sometimes it's like, oh, if that's it, like we can make that happen. So this is a really great question. Also asking like, why do you care so deeply? What is it about this that makes you feel this way? Something else really important for you all as families of a college student is asking your student, how long are you going to carry this if it's not resolved now? Like we certainly don't want to carry conflict for a long time. Sometimes that can lead to a deep level of resentment. The resentment is much harder to overcome than just resolving it. Now, a couple of other questions. These are questions you can ask yourself. Do not ask them to someone else that you're in conflict with. These are questions for yourself. Is there something you can take responsibility for? Especially when you've started a conversation, when you've engaged in this, maybe you're thinking, like, oh, yeah, I could probably take responsibility for that. Or maybe I owe an apology for that. Or maybe taking responsibility would completely change the way we're talking about this conversation or this conflict. And, I can take responsibility for that to change the way we view this. And then, is there something you can apologize for? Again, same thing as taking responsibility. I'm an advocate of never saying sorry unless you're really sorry. So, um, empty apologies are not, there should be no apology if it's only empty. But if you are having a conversation with your student, you're starting to realize, like, oh, maybe I did that. Maybe that's something I should apologize for. Being open about that and leading that can really open the door for more conversations. All right, I want to talk a little bit about conflict response styles. I'm not going to get too in depth to each of the conflict response styles because I think that will come in a future workshop. But I do want to just highlight the five conflict response styles and why it's important to have conversations about these. There is a tool where you can determine your conflict response style, which I will also talk about. So there are five conflict response styles: avoidant, aggressive, accommodating, compromising, and collaborative. The conflict response styles kind of look like this when you see them on a grid. So you can see down here we have at the bottom we have concern for results. So these are people who are just like looking to resolve it, they're looking to move on, you know, or maybe they have no concern about it. And then on the side, we have concern for the people. So this can also is often explained as concern for relationships. So this can often be, on the side is relationship, and on the bottom is task or priority, as well as results. So you can see that really the ideal conflict style is collaboration because that is an equal uh, stake in the concern for the people or the relationship and a concern for the results. Avoidance is the complete opposite. So, these conflict styles just like the care for people and the care for the results is like non existent. We just don't want conflict at all. Accommodation is the conflict style that will do anything to make sure the relationships are still intact. Often, this is like what we would consider a people pleaser. And then in the middle, we have compromise, and I'll talk a little bit about like why compromise isn't the ultimate goal. I mean, it's an option, of course. And then aggression is when someone's like very siloed on what the task is, what the priority is, and like just sees like this is it, this is where we need to be for these results. So one thing we talk about a lot in conflict is compromising or competing. So there are really three main types of conflict response. We have the five conflict response styles, and I think, they often fit into these three types of conflict. So that competing, like the aggressive conflict response style is really into this competing. It's like, well, somebody wins and someone loses. Obviously, this is not ideal. And compromise is like both people are giving up something that they don't want to give up, but they feel like they have to in order to reach an agreement. So I would consider this a lose lose situation. I would also consider avoiding a lose lose situation, and I would consider accommodation a win lose. Like again, one person's winning, one person's losing. And the ultimate goal is collaboration, where both parties or people have feel like they have a win, like it's a mutually beneficial agreement that they're both walking away with. So how do we do this? Obviously, collaboration is not the quickest or easiest response, but it does help to satisfy everyone's interests. So, like we talked about in the conflict iceberg, there, everyone does have interests. And so, building this collaborative approach seeks to understand everyone's interests and to satisfy those. In general, we feel like we're more well respected in a collaborative approach. Like we've been heard, people care what we're doing, we have a say in this, and it really encourages learning. It helps to build trust and build relationships. And truly, I think like collaboration is the basis for all teamwork. It's critical in all things that we do. Building a collaborative approach is sometimes really challenging. And here are some questions that you could ask as you're looking to build that. How could this conflict become a learning opportunity? So, okay, we've had this conflict. My college student has, done XYZ, which has led to this conflict. But how can we learn from this? How can both of us learn from this and move forward? A consideration for how you think other people see your actions. How can you learn more about their motivations? What's motivating your college student to challenge these norms or boundaries and challenge their independence? Are there deeper underlying issues in your conflict? This goes also back to the conflict iceberg when we think further down into the bottom of the iceberg. Is there really a lot more underlying issues that we need to take into consideration. And sometimes we may start at the top again, kind of like we talked about, and it gets deeper, deeper, deeper until you're like, okay, these actually need to be resolved in order to resolve this specific conflict. Is there empathetic and truthful feedback that you can provide? Um, Feedback is important. I think this is really challenging as a family member to your college student. what's the best way to provide feedback, what's the most empathetic feedback. Sometimes your student might not be open to feedback, and I think the delivery of it is really important. And if they've requested feedback from you, have you requested feedback from them? Like, what could they help you with? And finally, has your communication been clear? Often, I think we just as humans think like, well, I've already communicated that, but sometimes it's really not clear. So, going back, revisiting your communication, is there something I could say more clearly? Is there a better way I could say this? Would be really helpful. And to wrap this up, I just want to share some resources and personal reminders and some considerations in closing. Personal reminders are really important. I think this is really important in your situation as a family to a college student. This is not about you. So that is something you should repeat to yourself often. This is not about me. Often, I think parents can interpret conflicts as like a personal attack, or college students the same. Often just in general, we experience conflict as a personal attack, but it's not personal, it's not about you. Everyone is entitled to their own opinions. Everyone has their own perspectives. Do not make assumptions or jump to conclusions. This, again, is really hard in a family child relationship. And just pause before responding. I know I mentioned this earlier, but if you need time, this could be, a few minutes, a couple hours, a few days. Um, take that pause, take the time that you need so you can come back in the best way possible. I did want to share that there are some additional resources. One that I have found to be really helpful is a mediator in a box. This is a product that you can purchase from my website, and it is a 7-step mediation process. So it walks you through the 7 steps of mediation that are in this box. Often people say there's 4 steps to mediation or seven. This is a 7-step. It's an activity that you can do. Some people view it as like a board game for conflict that you can walk through, which can be really, really helpful. There are also plenty of books. Many books are really focused specifically on like workplace conflict or more structured conflict, but there are some that I think would be really helpful. Again, those Marshall Rosenberg books for nonviolent communication, I would highly recommend. And in closing, I just want to encourage you all to have dialogue, encourage you to actively to listen to understand, set expectations. So go into situations with some level of expectations, establish those guidelines and ground rules, and hold people accountable, hold your student accountable to their end and what they've agreed on, and provide empathetic, truthful feedback, especially when requested. Thank you so much. I am really so excited to be sharing this information with all of you as parents and families of a student at Georgia Tech. And you can reach me at the information below. You can view more on my website. There are more resources on my website as well. I would be happy to connect with each of you, and I look forward to seeing you in a future workshop.